It is also possible to use primary sources. This is going to be a lot more difficult. If you look up on Google Georgetown primary sources economic history, there's a good reference list that comes up. But again, it's going to be difficult to access because a lot of these things you would have to pay for in order to use. And I would, yeah, I would not say that is necessary, especially for an essay that is only 2,000 words. So we're going to be looking at economic history for this. And economic history is it's quite an interesting one because it's divided into people who, use mathematical formulae to explain, historical economic change in historical time periods. So they often take like a longer term view and analyze through actually data what had happened. And this is quite mathematical. The technical term for it is clerodynamics, and this was something that became popular, I think, in the 1990s. This question is slightly less technical. So if you did want to look at, sources, so if you were able to find a data set from, for example, Russia in the later 18th century, and you were able to read the data and say, look, these are very precise GDP estimates for the Russian economy in the 1750s versus the 1850s, and that would be a really good thing to do. But remember that this is a question which is probably going to make you rely more on the secondary sources, so what other scholars have already written, rather than the primary sources. It would be great to include primary sources, but you shouldn't necessarily feel pressured into doing so. And remember, again, that it's a very short essay, so sometimes you're not going to have the scope or the word count to do something that people would only really be doing an undergraduate or master's thesis. So, all that being said, let's get to the most interesting part of today, which is this book, A Farewell to Arms by Gregory Clark. So, when you approach a text, like a secondary source, like this one, which has been cited by a huge number of people, over 3,000, and these citations themselves have been cited maybe like over 1,000 times, you need to think about when it was written and how up to date it might be. So this was written in 2007, 17 years ago. It's still, in historical terms, it's still fairly modern, but it's not going to be representative of current historiographical debate. So, yeah, I think within the past 10 years, economic historians have shifted more towards a post colonial approach. But this, nonetheless, is really interesting because it shows you, almost acting as a historical source itself, it shows you what historians were preoccupied in the 2000s, the early 2000s. So, in this book, is, as it says, a brief economic history of the world. And it basically argues that the Industrial Revolution led to a divide between poor and rich countries. And Clark's central thesis inside the book, the word thesis, by the way, is really good, really useful to use when you're analysing or summarising what someone else has written. Clark's central thesis in his work is that the Industrial Revolution led to a divide between poor and rich countries. And he argues that countries like Britain, who managed to industrialize and become richer compared to other countries who are still living in poverty. The reason why Britain and these countries were able to do so is because of something called the Malthusian trap.